Hello, and welcome to Horns of a Dilemma, the podcast of the Texas National Security Review, TNSR. I'm Doyle Hodges, Executive Editor of TNSR. It's rare that on the Horns podcast we talk about love, but today's guest begins her discussion by describing the outreach of her organization as an outreach based on an active kind of love. Dulce Garcia is the Executive Director of Border Angels, a legal and outreach organization based in San Diego, California. Ms. Garcia is herself a recipient of the DACA program and is a practicing lawyer in the San Diego area. Her organization provides outreach to asylum seekers and border crossers, and in her talk, she describes specifically the challenges faced associated both with immigration policy, which has received lots of attention, but also the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic, which has received less attention in regarding its impact on the immigration situation. Ms. Garcia's talk provides a very personal face to an issue that is often discussed in terms that are abstract and focus on statistics. In fact, her organization is focused on helping individuals rather than on achieving mass levels of change. But this discussion provides great insight into the security implications of immigration, the security implications of asylum policy, and the human implications of the choices that are made regarding these things, not only in the Trump administration, but in administrations that preceded it, as well as the choices faced by the Biden administration. The talk is hosted by Julia Bordelon, a second-year master's student in the Department of Geography and Environment, and a Brumley Next Generation Fellow at the Strauss Center for International Security and Law. The talk is a part of the Strauss Center's Central America and Mexico Policy Initiative. Let's listen in.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to our Brumley Speaker Series. My name is Julia Bordelon. I'm a Brumley Graduate Fellow, and today I have the pleasure of introducing Dulce Garcia. So Ms. Garcia is an attorney and executive director of the San Diego-based organization Border Angels. She was raised in California, where she studied political science at San Diego City College and the University of California, San Diego, and she received her law degree from the Cleveland Marshall College of Law. Ms. Garcia opened her private practice in 2016, where she represents clients in cases on immigration, civil litigation, and criminal defense. And she also partners with the Mexican consulate and nonprofits to represent clients, and her practice hosts Know Your Rights workshops for the community as well. And her community-oriented work, though, really expands beyond her private practice. So as a DACA recipient herself, Ms. Garcia was a plaintiff in the lawsuit against the former Trump administration's termination of the DACA program in 2017. And currently, as the executive director of Border Angels, she helps lead their binational humanitarian and advocacy work along the southern border through a mission centered on a culture of love. Today, she will talk about this work and how the COVID-19 pandemic has affected immigration at the U.S.-Mexico border. And with that, please join me in welcoming Dulce Garcia.
Thank you. Yes, our mission is very much based on love, but it's an active kind of love. We show love for our neighbors, our migrant community. As we do water drops, we drop water and supplies in the desert, and we do so with a message of love and in hope of reducing the amount of deaths in our border. Since Operation Gatekeeper, since the wall went up, since we started to militarize more the southern border, we have seen an increased number of people dying. We estimate that it's over 11,000 deaths. In the fiscal year 2018, Border Patrol reported 283 deaths. These are folks that were actually confirmed as migrants crossing through the desert and passed away. But we can only imagine how many more were not found and passed away crossing the desert in hopes of surviving or having a better life in the U.S., and whose body has never been found and therefore is not part of this count. Unfortunately, because of the policies of the prior administration and with the world pandemic, the number of deaths and people crossing through the desert has increased. We see death also not only in the desert, but in the shelters. We see it in the detention centers. And all of this is a direct result of the failure of the administration to provide a humane way for people to migrate to the U.S. Since the Trump administration rescinded the asylum process, dismantled the asylum process, we have seen thousands of people having to wait in Tijuana. We have seen asylum seekers spend over a year on the Mexican border to survive. So our programs involved not only the water drop and the work in the desert, but also has expanded to providing a bond program in the last year. In the last year alone, we supported 69 migrants. We paid for their bonds to be released from the detention center. We supported over a dozen shelters in the Tijuana side of the border. And we supported a new program as well that we called Green Card for Kids, as well as continued other programs here in San Diego County, such as our day labor outreach and internships. Now, all of these programs have been directly impacted by COVID. Because of COVID, we had to shut down our Caravan of Love. That caravan would line up over a dozen vehicles with volunteers carrying over to the Tijuana side donations in kind for the various shelters. Because of COVID, the border was closed to only essential travel. And so we had to stop our Caravan of Love to protect also the shelters and try to control the spread of COVID-19. So instead, what we have done is we focused our work in providing monetary support directly to the shelters and having a more direct conversation with them as to what it is that they needed. One of the shelters, for example, needed more space. Should someone become test positive for COVID, they needed a place to quarantine. And if you can imagine having 200 people in one shelter, it's nearly impossible to keep a 6 feet distance, to socially distance with over 100 people that are in an enclosed space. And so we provided the monetary support. They provided their own labor and they expanded their shelter. In other shelters, it was hard to tell them to disinfect everything and keep everything clean when they depended on sunlight to dry their clothes. They couldn't just throw their clothing in a washer and dryer. Even when they had over 100 people, they didn't have something as basic as a washer and dryer for them to keep things clean, whether it was sheets or clothing, or even the reusable masks that we were providing. So for some of these shelters, we provided over 20 sets of these appliances. Some didn't even have a refrigerator, so we provided a refrigerator and many other things that we realized were needed at these places to provide a decent place for migrants to wait, at least in a dignified way, in Tijuana while their asylum case was being processed. Some needed something as basic as a new mattress, as a new bed, bed sheets. And with that, we realized that we also needed to keep pushing to end the MPP program. And so while we do some of this work, while we provide direct humanitarian aid, we're also doing at the same time the advocacy work that is needed to make real change. And so we celebrate the new administration taking on some of these issues already and having a dialogue with us. But we know that there's a lot more work to be done, and particularly in the shelters. We saw that people in the shelters were becoming so desperate because they kept getting their dates pushed, their court hearings pushed and pushed and pushed. And so some of them have been there for almost 2 years and still don't have an end in sight. And so some have returned home back to danger. Some have attempted to cross through the desert. And so in the last year or so, we saw an increased number of people, families attempting to cross through the desert. And so we saw indicators in the desert of kids crossing. We've been seeing kids' shoes, backpacks, toys, female hygiene products, things that indicate to us that it's not just the sole male migrant, but it's actually families, women and children that that are crossing the desert and in doing so in higher numbers. We've seen also an increased number of children presenting themselves at the port of entry alone because the administration created an incentive to separate families, to deter migration. And so families, mothers, parents had to send their kids alone so that they could have a chance of entering the country, even if it was without their parent, and then have the hope of being reunited later. So we created this Green Cards for Kids program in collaboration with one of the counties here in California that provides legal representation for these kids. These kids were navigating the system and the foster care system without legal representation in immigration proceedings. And so the administration, in all its wise decisions, decided to place these kids in removal proceedings to deport these kids without legal representation in immigration proceedings. And so Border Angels identified this gap and provided support for a dozen kids that are in the custody of the county and that have suffered either abuse, abandonment, or neglect by one or more parents and are in danger if they were to be returned to their home country. And so, in collaboration with a private attorney, we've been able to successfully stop the deportation of at least one child and are in the process of applying for these kids for something called special juvenile status that would allow them to not only remain here in the US, but eventually process a green card, eventually receive this residency, permanent residency, and then eventually, hopefully, one day apply for citizenship. And as we're doing this work, we also identified that the people that were in detention were at greater risk of dying from COVID because, again, you can't socially distance yourself with 100 other people in your unit. Here in San Diego County, we have the Otay Detention Center, Otay Mesa Detention Center, and that detention center is run by a private corporation. So at the end of the day, what they're about is profiting. They are profiting from the suffering and the pain that our people are going through in that detention center. It's a federal prison where we're placing people that are asking for asylum, people that are asking for protection, people that are running away from their country because they have endured some great suffering. As an example, we had one asylum seeker whose child was killed in front of her, along with her husband. And she came from Africa and made it through 13 different countries to travel to make it to our border. And instead of welcoming her and embracing her, we put her in a detention center. And then we asked for a ransom to pay for her liberty to get her out of the detention center. The way that we treated her, and I mean the federal government treated her, is just cruel. And we have plenty of stories like that. All of the 69 folks that we have supported in the bond program have a similar story. There are people from over 19 different countries that have come and that we have supported have a story where they have endured great suffering. One was actually gouged and lit on fire and survived by miracle, and with the hopes of surviving in the U.S., traveled through South America and was placed in a detention center in Mexico, traveled through Mexico after being released after 6 months, showed up at a port of entry, and then was placed in a detention center for another 4 months until we paid thousands of dollars to get him out. And we have seen that some of the most vulnerable people among us, not just women and children, but also trans women, people that are from African countries, they are the ones that have been placed at risk even more as they have endured this long journey to make it to our border. And then again, we ask for a ransom to allow them to continue with their asylum case inside of the U.S. So we hope and we will be pushing this new Biden administration to end the detention of migrants that are presenting themselves at the port of entry with the hopes of surviving. Because if it's not done so through legal means, and if asylum is not fully restored, we're going to see more people attempting to cross through the desert. And we're going to keep receiving these emergency calls where a sibling is calling because their brother is missing in the desert, or somebody's dad is missing in the desert. We receive these calls, these heartbreaking calls, all this time, constantly. In the last few weeks, I personally received 3 of them, where 2 of them were in around Texas, and family members were desperate to find out where their sibling was, where their loved one. And it's heartbreaking that guides do see this as an opportunity to take advantage of migrant siblings, and often leave people behind in the desert. And some get lost and we never find them. Again, all of this a direct result of the policies that came about not only in the last 4 years with the Trump administration, but that have been around for decades since Operation Gatekeeper and the walls went up. There has been a need for us to put supplies and drop water in the desert. The bond program is something that other organizations, and again, we don't do this work in isolation. We do it with a collaboration of many other organizations to do this work, including, as an example, the National Bail Fund Network, to collaborate to get as many people out of these detention centers. But these detention centers, the system has been in place for many years, many years. I've had my brother be put in a detention center way before the Trump administration, and he eventually qualified for DACA, but he was put in a detention center, and we were being asked to pay $15,000 to get him out of the detention center. As an undocumented person, saving even one single dollar is a challenge. To save $15,000, it's nearly impossible when you're getting paid less than minimum wage, when you're getting paid under the table or working in the shadows. So for the government to ask us, ICE, to ask $15,000 for the release of my brother was nearly impossible. And since then, I thought the country was moving in a much more progressive way, and then we had the Trump administration that increased and made everything a lot more difficult here on the border, and the suffering has certainly been exponentiated. But with COVID, the challenges have even increased more, because we saw the first death inside of the detention here in Otay Mesa, the Otay Mesa Detention Center. So we knew that we needed to act quickly to get as many people out of the detention center. But it was so heartbreaking that sometimes we were ready and willing and able to pay for the bond that they were asking, the thousands of dollars that they were asking for some of these people. And they were being put in a quarantine zone and not let us pay for their bond. And so what would happen is someone would test positive or show signs that they were positive for COVID. And then the rest of the unit, where there was 100 people or more sometimes, they would be in this isolation area. And even if they were not showing signs of having COVID, they would not be released. They would be quarantined. And so essentially what they were doing is, one person could have infected all the rest of them, all 100 people. And they were just, hoping that no one else would die, without really strategy behind it, making sure that everyone gets released so that people wouldn't die. So for us, it was counterintuitive to not allow people to be released, and instead forcing them to stay in an area where other people were showing signs of COVID-19. And sure enough, that's how we saw more and more people become sick and die. The work in the detention centers has not stopped. It's only been made worse with COVID, and we are still having to push the administration to release people, especially when we're still seeing high numbers of contaminations in this places, where they just don't have access to be able to control them. One of the migrants inside of the detention center called very desperate, afraid that he was going to die in there, and that he wasn't going to be able to say goodbye to his daughter and his wife. They had been separated at the border They were all asking for asylum, and his wife and his child were allowed to go through and paroled in, but he was placed in a detention center, and he was afraid of dying from COVID. And he told us that he didn't have access to a mask, and that they weren't providing disinfectant or gel because the guards were saying that they were going to use it for alcohol. And so how can you stay safe in a place where you're sleeping with 8 other people in your cell, and around 100 other people, when you're not being allowed to have any kind of protective gear on you? And as a community, we came together to provide masks for the detention centers. We had community members able to sew these masks and donate them, and the detention center wouldn't take them. Again, we have created a system where there's the incentive for these private corporations to not release people because they're getting paid per bed. And one of the first things that the Trump administration did was ask Congress for an increased number of beds in these detention centers, with the expectation that they were going to get filled in. And as long as we have these private corporations running these places that are supposed to be housing our migrant siblings in a dignified way, we're going to see that there's going to be suffering and a lack of resources and services for these folks. I have personally gone inside of these detention centers and have seen people that have been placed on suicide watch. It's such a depressing place, but they're not offered mental health services. Their health screening involves a 3-minute check-in with a nurse, and you are asked, have you ever had a mental health issue? And some of these folks culturally don't even know what that means. I'm not even sure what that means. And then they just push through the system, put in a detention center, and these folks are given an A number, an alien registration number, and referred by the number, not by their name. And everything is meant to dehumanize them. They get shoes without shoelaces so that they don't commit suicide, jumpsuits, color coded to identify whether somebody has any criminal history or not. It's just the entire place is it's conducive to having these folks be depressed and call us in desperation. It's always heartbreaking to get these calls from people that are inside of the detention center that are afraid of dying in there, and afraid of harassment in there, and even afraid of some of the guards. And so these places that are run by these private corporations have really no oversight. They report to ICE, and then ICE reports to no one. No one is holding accountable ICE for what happens with all the human rights violations that are happening inside of the detention centers, of the ways that migrants are punished for even speaking out and demanding something as crucial as a mask. Folks have been sprayed with chemicals and have bled because of the harsh chemicals that were sprayed to disinfect these places. And all of these complaints have resulted in punishing the migrants that are in the detention centers. And no one's holding accountable the private agencies, and no one's holding accountable ICE. The difficulty that we have when we do this work is that we know that paying bonds is not the end all of it. We have to change the system. And so that's where the advocacy work becomes crucial. It's been really challenging with COVID. We would do more protests outside, and with COVID, we've had to become creative and do webinars like this one to inform the community of what's happening, and have meetings with legislators in this format and calling them out on our social media. So if you don't follow Border Angels, I ask that you please follow us on social media or register for our newsletter so that you stay informed, because the work is not going to end now that we have a new administration. If anything, it's going to require a ton of work to push for the new administration to undo the system that has been in place for a while. That the conditions given COVID exacerbated the need for this work to continue on the humanitarian perspective. But again, the work in the desert has been needed since Operation Gatekeeper. The work in the detention centers has been done by various organizations for decades now. And as long as we're still having contracts with private agencies like Core Civic that runs the Old Town Detention Center, as long as we are still putting in charge private corporations, we're going to see violations of human rights in these detention centers. As far as the support needed in the shelters, the excuse for closing the border has been COVID. And that is what the new administration, the Biden administration, is citing for not allowing all of these folks to come in. But every single day that they spend outside of the U.S. is a day that people might lose hope. And it's a day that they have to endure. The people in Tijuana have had all this time without access to healthcare, without the right to education. And so these kids have spent over a year in Tijuana without education because they're migrants in Mexico coming from all over the world, and they don't have the paperwork to enroll in school, to use the healthcare system. And so the community has had to step up. Border Angels has supported one of the very few organizations that are in Tijuana, Refugee Health Alliance, that is a volunteer program from the UCSD medical school that has provided assistance in the shelters, and especially around when the pandemic broke out. Very simple water stations. Some of these shelters had no way to even wash their hands, and so with about $180, they were able to create one water station at a shelter, and so that replicated this in the over a dozen shelters to provide water stations for these folks so that they could even wash their hands, and providing healthcare screenings. There's still a lack of healthcare. The situation in Tijuana has only worsened with COVID. They have a high rate of deaths happening. They haven't been able to control COVID in Tijuana. So that's one of the biggest fears that we have, that should COVID hit one of the bigger shelters, one of the shelters where there's over 100 people being housed and over 40 kids, that we're afraid that some of the folks that haven't received healthcare attention in over a year are very vulnerable. And that's one of our biggest concerns. And that's one of the reasons why we're pushing the Biden administration to go ahead and start processing these people that have been waiting for so long in Tijuana. With COVID, we've had to close our volunteer programs to try to protect everyone and encourage everyone to stay at home. And so the volunteer opportunities that we've offered have been virtual opportunities, whether it's internships or tutoring online. We're still taking those if you're interested, but we did have to shut down our public water drops, our day labor outreach, where we go to the different Home Depots to provide resources to day laborers. And so, unfortunately, it's only been a small team that's been doing this work to encourage people to stay at home during the pandemic. But hopefully this year we'll open up again these programs. But for the day labor outreach, what we have noticed is that because the Trump administration also took away the work permit for asylum seekers as they were navigating through their case, it created an incentive for our migrant siblings that were going through the asylum process to work unlawfully. And so we saw an increased number of Haitians and Central Americans by the Home Depots working on a day-to-day. And some of them living in their car, and they work all day and then they send money home. But because of COVID, they were struggling financially even more because people weren't doing more of their construction projects and they weren't hiring them. But what we also noticed was that the abuse, the rhetoric, the hateful rhetoric that the prior administration, the Trump administration, used actually translated to hateful rhetoric coming from the community locally as well. And so some migrants did report that they were being harassed by other community members, people that would drive up to them and scream at them all kinds of horrible things. Some would work all day and then not get paid at the end of the day, and they would be threatened with deportation from ICE. And so we saw an increased number of those incidences with the Trump administration and an increased fear. People didn't want to report it because they were afraid that it would impact their asylum case and they didn't want any trouble. So those are the changes that we saw with this last administration. And because of COVID, we know that they are suffering even more because the number of projects that people have out there in the community have decreased. And so for that reason, we've had to increase the kind of support that we offer them.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Horns of a Dilemma, and please don't forget to visit our website at tnsr.org.